VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
Well, thank you for joining us today here on Crosstalk on the VCY American Network. We're going to raise a topic that it's been a little while since it's been addressed here on Crosstalk, but we know that it's at the, on the front burner here of the Obama administration, and that is the topic of global climate change. We're going to give a special welcome back to guest Dr. E. Calvin Beisner, the founder and national spokesman for the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. The Cornwall Alliance is a coalition of clergy, theologians, religious leaders, scientists, academics, and policy experts that are committed to bringing a balanced biblical view of stewardship to the critical issues of environment and development. He's published over 10 books, has written hundreds of articles. Dr. Beisner, welcome back here to Crosstalk.
Thanks very much, Jim. It's always good to be with you. I gather you're experiencing a little bit of global warming up north there.
Yeah, it's certainly the changes that we've seen in one weekend alone from frigid cold temperatures to snow to rain and warm temperatures. It's been bizarre, and we're going to talk about some of these aspects here because some have indicated that means that we are having global climate change and need to address it. But let's go back here. We know that the Obama administration during their first term gave a lot of credence to global climate change, and it didn't take too long into his second term in office to indicate that climate change was going to be on his agenda. Namely, it was referenced in the inauguration. Did this surprise you, Dr. Beisner, that this made part of the inauguration speech?
No, not at all, because Jim, Obama had said last summer that he intended to make global warming or climate change the top priority in his second term, if he were to win a second term. So, taking him as a man of his word, we expected that he would do this sort of thing, and yes, indeed, he did.
I want to share a few of the statements that he made and get your response to them. Some of the things that stood out in the speech. He said,
Sure.
quote, he said, "We the people still believe that our obligations as Americans are not just to ourselves, but to all posterity. We will respond to the threat of climate change, knowing that the failure to do so would betray our children and future generations."
Betray our children, right? How about betraying them by increasing the national debt by $10 trillion in 4 years and laying out a fiscal path that's going to expand it more, saddling every child born in America with $50,000 in debt at the moment of birth? You know, our national debt is likely to harm our children and our grandchildren a great deal more than climate change will. And that's because, as even the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has forecast, poverty leads to far more illnesses and far more premature deaths over the coming century than even the high-end projections of global warming. So this is just simply not something where he's really paying attention to the good of our children. He is instead going to spend additional trillions trying to fight global warming, uselessly, needlessly, I would say, and add even more to the debt that they have to pay.
How do you feel about his using the term threat of climate change?
Oh, well, that, of course, assumes that there is something unusual going on, and there's nothing historically unprecedented about either the rate or the magnitude of any global warming that has happened in the last, 150 years, if we go back to the end of the Little Ice Age, or the last 30 years or 35 years or so, if we go back during just the period of satellite temperature measurements. The fears of man-made global warming were generated by warming that happened essentially from about 1980 to 1996 or 1997. That was a period of significant warming, but it wasn't historically unprecedented. It was very similar to earlier periods, in fact, even in the 20th century, but plenty long before that. That's basically a 17-year period. Well, so far, since 1997, we have had 16 straight years of no statistically significant global warming. And that means we've had just as long a time without warming as we did with warming, and yet the supposed cause of the warming, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, has continued to rise even faster than it was rising during that period of warming. So there's every indication that that is not the real driver of the recent warming. It is instead natural causes. And so it's not a threat. It's just a natural cycle.
Here's another quote from the inauguration. He said, "Some may still deny the overwhelming judgment of science, but none can avoid the devastating impact of raging fires and crippling drought and more powerful storms."
Yeah. Well, I think the president needs to get his speechwriters to do a little bit of fact-checking. There may be an overwhelming judgment of science that Earth is warmer now than it was 150 years ago, and that's true. But there is no overwhelming judgment of science that human emission of greenhouse gases was the main or even a major cause of that warming. There's no overwhelming judgment of science that now or in the foreseeable future it'll cause dangerous global warming, or that costly policies to reduce those emissions will reduce future temperatures significantly. And especially, there is no overwhelming scientific consensus, there is indeed no significant scientific evidence at all, that whatever reduction might be achieved would bring more benefits than it would harm to humanity, because it would be extremely costly and would therefore contribute to poverty, which is a much greater threat than warming. Furthermore, the global warming from the mid-70s to the mid-90s, and there's been none since then, did not cause any increase in the frequency or severity of any extreme weather events, not floods, not droughts, not hurricanes, not tornadoes, not anything else, including raging fires or crippling drought.
Mm-hmm.
There's been no increase in the frequency or the intensity of those at all. However, green-driven policies to stop managing forests have contributed to bigger and more frequent fires because there's simply more fuel left in the forests because we're not allowed to harvest those forests.
Well, I found what was interesting is just one day after Mr. Obama made this statement in the inauguration speech, his press secretary, Jay Carney, was questioned in the daily press conference at the White House if the storms that Obama referred to would make it more likely that cap-and-trade legislation would pass. And Jay Carney said, quote, "The president made clear that climate change is real. That is certainly the conviction held by most Americans and certainly backed up by the vast majority of science. No specific story or weather event can be tied to climate change, but the fact is," he said, "we have seen more severe storms."
That is simply not true. That is what is predicted by some of the global climate models done on computers, but it is not borne out by actual empirical observation of whether it be floods or droughts, hurricanes, tornadoes, thunderstorms, wildfires, heat waves, cold snaps, anything else. There is no trend either up or down in the frequency of any of those things when compared with the historic record. Dr. John Christie, who is a climatologist at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, and works along with Dr. Roy Spencer, who is one of Cornwall Alliance's senior fellows, on the NASA Aqua Satellite remote sensing program. Dr. Christie testified before both the Senate and the House of Representatives committees in August and September, giving the hard numerical data based on empirical observation, showing that, in fact, there's been no increase in either the number of such problems or the intensity of such problems. So the whole thing is a matter of confusing computer models, which are simply sophisticated hypotheses, not actual observation of the world, with empirical observation of the world. That's not good science. Good science says, yeah, sure, we model in order to make hypotheses, but then we test those hypotheses by comparing them with real observations of the real world, and those models are failing miserably.
Now, does that take into account Superstorm Sandy, Hurricane Sandy, and
absolutely.
and then also that huge snowfall this past weekend out east?
Yes, absolutely. absolutely. Neither one of those was the least bit historically unprecedented. Indeed, in 1826, long before human emissions of CO2 became high enough for anybody to think that they were affecting global temperatures, 1826, there was a much more powerful Frankenstorm, so to speak, from the same kind of a combination of a tropical cyclone moving north and then a nor'easter coming southwest and hitting essentially the same locale of the East Coast. Far more powerful. Remember, Sandy was not even hurricane strength when she made landfall. She was big because of the combination of the two storms, but it had nothing to do with global average temperature. Indeed, the average temperature of the Atlantic surface in that region had been falling for the last several years rather than rising. So, according to the global warming alarmists, it must have been a warmer sea surface that would have caused a devastating storm like that. But in fact, the sea surface was cooler. So Sandy was not extraordinarily powerful. She was not extraordinarily large. What was extraordinary was how many people and how much property were in her path, because we've grown in population, grown in infrastructure, buildings, things of that sort that were in her path. The wonderful thing, though, is that she killed so few people, and that is because people had become wealthy and therefore been able to build homes and office buildings and the like that provided them great protection from
Superstorm.
What do we call
the hurricane?
Frankenstorm?
Yeah, there we go.
Sandy. They were protected by the wealth that they had built over the years. What's risky is that in trying to fight global warming, we will waste trillions of dollars reducing CO2 emissions that won't be usable to build that kind of wealth to protect people. And that will hurt people not only in America, but around the world, especially the developing world, where if a storm like that hit a very poor country, it would kill far more people.
He, I believe he concluded his remarks at the inauguration. He said, that is how we will maintain our economic viability, or rather our vitality, and our national treasure, our forests and waterways, our croplands and snow-capped peaks. This is how we will preserve our planet, commanded to our care by God. That's what will lend meaning to the creed of our fathers once declared. No. That's
how we will impoverish ourselves, leaving us unable to afford the continued wise management of our forests and waterways and the fruitful cultivation of our croplands that has made and kept America one of the cleanest, most healthful, most beautiful countries on earth. And the planet, I'm sorry, but despite what Mr. Obama says, the planet doesn't need preserving. And God never commanded us in Scripture to preserve it. He didn't command people to preserve the land, but instead he promised himself, after the great flood, to preserve earth until the last judgment. That's in Genesis 8:22. But he does tell us that we are supposed to use wise management to exercise a godly dominion over the earth, causing it to be more fruitful, beautiful, and safe for the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors.
Dr. Calvin Beisner, our guest here today on Crosstalk from the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We're going to take a 60-second break and be right back with more discussion on the so-called global climate change. You're listening to Crosstalk here on the VCY America Network.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, creation researcher and scientist at the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, can evidence for origins be understood in more than one way?
Yes, they certainly can, Chris, and this is the essence of the creation evolution question. Both sides have exactly the same evidence. We have the same fossil record, the same modern organisms with the same DNA code. It's just that we tell different stories about their unobserved history. The creation evolution question is really a historical question. I'm convinced as a scientist that the scientific evidence supports the creation idea that we glean from Scripture much more than it does the evolution idea that was gleaned from human reasoning. God gives us the big picture in Scripture. For the origins question, we must start back in Genesis.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. For a better understanding of the world around you from a creationist perspective, Visit us on the web at www.icr.org. I'm Chris O'Brien. Thanks for tuning in.
This is Crosstalk on VCY America. We're talking today with Dr. E. Calvin Beisner from the Cornwall Alliance, and we're talking about global climate change. It is on the front burner for the Obama administration here in the second term. It became prevalent in his speech that took place at the inauguration. And as we take a look at this, and there's been some recent developments since this as well, but let's look at that speech, Dr. Beisner, as far as the worldview that comes, Mr. Obama's environmental worldview. Your comments on what he talked about, this so-called creed that he spoke of.
Yeah, he said that by fighting global warming, we would be lending meaning to, quote, the creed our fathers once declared. Well, as a matter of fact, Obama's creed here is not the creed of the Bible, and it's not the creed of America's founders. It's the creed of environmentalism, and that worldview, that creed, sees people as consumers and polluters, not as producers and stewards. Sees them as using up resources and poisoning the planet in the process, whereas the Bible sees people as created in God's image to be productive and creative and good stewards, as He is. The environmental creed sees private property, a God-given right ensconced in our 5th and 14th Amendments, as well as put into the 8th Commandment, you shall not steal, as the root, not the solution of environmental degradation, but history tells us that private property is the greatest way to protect the environment. People take care of what belongs to them. The environmental creed sees liberty, another God-given right, ensconced not only in the 5th and 14th Amendments, but also in our Declaration of Independence, as a threat to environmental sustainability, rather than seeing it as the means of securing environmental sustainability. But free countries with responsive, democratically elected governments that govern by the consent of the governed have the best environmental records. The worst environmental records are in communist and socialist countries, which are not so free. And finally, the environmental creed sees human life itself, yet another God-given right ensconced in our founding documents, not as the provision God made for ruling His earth as His representative, as He told us in Genesis 1:28, but instead sees people as people pollution, carbon footprints, a cancer on the face of the earth, and human viruses. That, frankly, is an anti-biblical worldview. It's also quite contrary to the whole American understanding of man's role on earth and of the kind of government that man most needs. So I would say that the President's comments there are both unbiblical and un-American.
An interesting story came out on CNSnews.com February 8th about this U.S. Commerce Department created a National Climate Assessment and Development Advisory Committee. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting is that this advisory committee, appointed by the Obama administration, they were to produce a report on climate change. Their report says that if Earth's climate weren't still primarily controlled by natural factors rather than by man-made global warming, then the next ice age would occur within the next 1,500 years. But now, because of humans, the committee says the next ice age has been delayed indefinitely.
Well, first off, I think that's just simply silly because, as I said in the first segment of the program, neither the magnitude nor the rate of global warming that has been measured in the past 50 years or the past 150 years, whichever way you want to take it, has been historically unprecedented. They've both been well within the range of natural climate variability. That indicates that human emission of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, has not been the primary driver of climate change, or particularly global warming, over the last 50 or 150 years. As a matter of fact, there's very good scientific evidence that cycles in solar energy output, solar magnetic wind output, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the North Atlantic Oscillation, these are both ocean current cycles, and various other cycles are far more powerful in shaping Earth's climate, including in the most recent days. As a matter of fact, even over the last 50 years or so, the changes in carbon dioxide emission, concentration in the atmosphere have followed changes in global average temperature rather than vice versa. If CO2 changes were causing the temperature changes, the sequence ought to be exactly the opposite. So, quite simply, we're not causing the climate change. Now, furthermore, the notion that we are delaying something that would occur 1,500 years from now is absurd in that we have no idea what people are going to be using as their primary energy sources 100 or 200 or 400 or 1,500 years from now. Mm-hmm. Who in the world could have guessed, even a century and a half ago, that the vast majority of energy used by the world today would come from natural gas, nuclear, oil, coal, and those sources, rather than from wood and peat and dried dung, the primary sources before. No one could have imagined. And to think that human technological development is going to cease so that we can predict what people are going to be doing 1,200 or 1,500 or even 100 years from now is simply absurd.
Congress has not been quick to act on these aspects of the president's agenda. Are you concerned, Dr. Beisner, that the president is, in essence, going to legislate by means of the executive order to enact his policies in this regard?
Oh, yes. I think that's quite clear. He has been using the Environmental Protection Agency to push through regulations that Congress refused to pass. Congress refused to pass, for example, a cap-and-trade bill to put a cap on CO2 emissions and then give out permits that companies could trade with each other for permission to emit CO2. Congress refused to pass that, and the EPA has now declared CO2 to be a dangerous pollutant according to the definitions of the Clean Air Act, and that is despite the fact that a part of the Clean Air Act actually explicitly excludes CO2 from the list of pollutants governed by the Act. And the EPA is now setting down regulations on emissions of CO2, again in violation of the actual wording of the Clean Air Act. The wording of the Clean Air Act says that any so-called dangerous pollutant that is emitted to the tune of over, I believe it's 250 tons, that's 250 tons per year by a source, needs to be regulated. Well, that would include even most decently large houses, certainly almost all businesses, as not simply electric generating plants and things like that. That would require millions and millions of permit applications every year, and would require the hiring of hundreds of thousands of new permit evaluating employees by the EPA. So the EPA has unilaterally rewritten the statute, which is unconstitutional, saying, no, we're going to do what we call a tailoring rule here. We're going to say it's not 250 tons, it's 250,000 tons per year. Any source that emits more than that, we want to regulate. Well, that's not what Congress said. And so we have here an administration which, through its EPA, is taking the law into its own hands, is violating the separation of powers in the Constitution, and acting in a way that is not properly accountable to the people. And that's the genius of our Constitution, is that the lawmaking power is vested in the legislature, which is far more accountable to the people than the presidency, the executive branch, or the courts. But this executive apparently doesn't much care.
Well, and then let's look at a former one that was in the executive role. Well, Vice President Al Gore, he continues his speaking tour. I mean, he makes his big speech about the danger of carbon emissions and gets on his jet and flies to his next speaking engagement. Yeah. But here is an excerpt. It's about a minute long. This is an online interview that he had with PBS's NewsHour, January 31st. And I'd like you to listen to what he said about the public being lulled into sleep and using our atmosphere as an open sewer, and we'll get your comments afterwards. Let's listen into what former Vice President Al Gore had to say.
Every news and commentary program on television, it has heavy advertising from coal, oil, gas. When they show you an ad from the coal industry, their purpose is not to convince you to say, oh, I'm going to go down to the corner store and buy some coal. That's not the purpose. Their purpose is to condition your political thinking so that when policymakers, members of the Congress, face a conflict between a broad, diffuse public interest and a passionate, the public is lulled into an acceptance of going along with this policy of using the atmosphere as an open sewer. That's what we're doing. 90 million tons of global warming pollution every day, trapping enough extra heat every day that's the equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs going off every 24 hours.
Dr. Beisner.
Well, first of all, of course, if he thinks that carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere is comparable to what goes into an open sewer, meaning human waste, feces and urine, then he thinks that what every one of us exhales every time we exhale is sewage. Now, that might describe the content of Gore's statement there, sewage coming out of his mouth, but it certainly doesn't describe the content of the exhalation of every human being and every other animal on the face of the earth, every breath that we take. He's got his chemistry mixed up. He doesn't understand. Carbon dioxide is not sewage. Carbon dioxide is absolutely essential to life. Plants use it for photosynthesis. And in fact, with every doubling of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, you get an average 35% increase in plant growth efficiency, which means that you get more crops per acre, more crop yield per acre. You're able to feed more people less expensively. You don't have to farm as much land in order to feed those people. That's a very good thing. In terms of geologic history, carbon dioxide, even now, even though we've raised it from about 270 parts per million to about 390 parts per million, is still at the low end of its normal concentration in geologic history, and that helps to explain why so much of the world is desert now. With more CO2 in the air, plants grow better in drier as well as wetter conditions, in higher and lower altitudes, in higher and lower temperatures. They resist pests better. They resist diseases better. CO2 is altogether a good thing. Now, Gore is quite the man to speak. This is the same man whose own house uses 20 times as much energy every year as does the average American house. And it's also the same man who just sold his cable television channel for over $200 million to Al Jazeera, the television network, cable television network that is an Al-Qaeda supporter and that is funded primarily by oil money out of the nation of Qatar. We might even make a little pun there. He's talking about sewers, we're talking about gutter, the nation of Qatar, as the origin of this money that he just received for the sale of his cable TV channel. And by the way, Glenn Beck had offered to buy his cable TV channel, and he turned that down, explaining that he didn't want the channel to come into the hands of somebody with Glenn Beck's values. Apparently, he likes the values of Al-Qaeda supporter Al Jazeera better.
Wow. Well, Dr. E. Kelvin Beisner is our guest here today on Crosstalk. We'd like to open our phone lines for you to get involved in asking a question, making a comment today. Our telephone number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829, 800-733-9829. Your reaction. We'll be right back.
Nearly 90% of Christian children attend a public school. Filmmaker Colin Gunn, a homeschool father of 7, went on the field trip of a lifetime. Driving an old school bus, Colin and his family traveled across the nation, exploring the origins and social impact of public school education to discover if children are morally and physically safe, if public schools are religiously neutral, and should Christians try to be salt and light in secular schools. 102 minutes in length, it's an impactful message. In the companion book, Indoctrination, some 18 writers come together to look at how the educational system is actively at work to alter your child's moral values, worldview, and religious beliefs. It explores the biblical principles regarding education and who is ultimately responsible for our children's future. The Indoctrination DVD is available for a donation of $22. The book is available for a donation of $18, or you can obtain both for a donation of $35. To obtain yours, call 1-800-729-9829, 1-800-729-9829.
Keep in mind, folks, that Mr. Obama has pledged to put this at the top of his agenda. I mean, it's going to be on the front burner and bringing about global climate change legislation, cap and trade, executive orders, on and on the list goes. And we'd like to get your feedback on that here today, as well as questions pertaining to this topic of global climate change. Perhaps there's something that's just been puzzling you on this issue, and you'd like to ask. Dr. Beisner certainly is an expert on many of these issues, as he represents the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Dr. Beisner, give us a word about the organization and some of the things you're doing there.
Well, thank you. Jim, we are a network of evangelical theologians, scientists, economists, and ministry leaders dedicated to promoting simultaneously biblical earth stewardship, which is not the same thing as environmentalism, but rather it is godly dominion over the earth. God told us in Genesis 1:28 that we were supposed to multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over it. And that godly dominion would look like men and women working together to enhance the fruitfulness, beauty, and safety of the earth, the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors, thus addressing both of the two great commandments, to love God and to love neighbor. We also promote economic development for the very poor. Think in terms of people in sub-Saharan Africa, not people here in the United States who, by comparison, are amazingly rich. And finally, we promote and practice the proclamation and defense of the gospel of Jesus Christ. All of this in a world permeated by an environmental movement whose worldview, theology, and ethics are overwhelmingly anti-Christian, whose science and economics are often very badly flawed, whose policies, therefore, often don't actually do anything significant to help the environment, but do harm the poor, and which constitutes a serious threat to the integrity of the Christian faith, because environmental organizations are intentionally infiltrating churches, seeking to green the message, and substituting their own doctrines of God, creation, humanity, and sin and salvation for the historic doctrines of the Christian faith taught in the Bible, the Word of God. So we try to address all of those things together. We've got a wonderful network of about 60 scholars who work with us on a volunteer basis, as well as some staff, and we welcome people to come to our website, cornwallalliance.org, or visit us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/Cornwall Alliance. And they can sign up for our free weekly newsletter at cornwallalliance.org, as well as read plenty of articles on our website and just learn all sorts of things. And we have speakers available for churches, colleges, seminaries, schools, and other groups.
Again, folks, the website, cornwallalliance.org. Let's go to the phone lines. We have Fred, who's calling in from Wisconsin. Fred, thanks for calling. You're on the air.
Yes, I was wondering if anything was heard about Israel's plant genetics, where they develop something that they can do to trees, that a 10, 20-year-old tree could be harvested a certain height off the ground and it would replace itself within 3 years. Has anything been said about that?
Yeah, Fred, I did hear about that. I think it was about 4 or 5 months ago that I read an article or two about it. It's a very exciting development. This grows trees that, amazingly enough, are as dense as trees that grow at a much slower normal pace, but it grows them at over 3 times the normal pace, which means that they can be harvested sooner. That's a tremendous breakthrough that will allow for lumber to become more available and more affordable around the world, not only in Israel. So that's one of the different ways in which, frankly, we can subdue and have dominion over the earth. We do it when we improve soil productivity through cultivation and irrigation, and when we improve crop growth through insecticides, herbicides, fungicides. and when we improve crops or even livestock through breeding and most recently through what you just mentioned, a bit of genetic engineering, where we're able to take a specific chromosome from one species and splice it into another species. Now, what we're doing there is really the same thing that we did with hybridization, except in this instance, we're able to specify the precise characteristic that we want to affect through this. So genetic engineering is one more step in human dominion over the earth, and like any technology, it has its risks, but it also has its great benefits, and I see this as something that we should be celebrating.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Our number 800-733-9829. Daniel from Lublin, you're on the air.
Yes, I wondered if your guest would comment on the possibility of coming up with or coining a phrase to compete with global climate change, such as a natural climate cycle or something to this effect, that could take hold and to compete with these guys.
Well, in a sense, the other side has already done that for us by switching from talking about global warming, which essentially stopped 17 years ago, to climate change. Now, the problem with their doing that is that climate always changes. That's what climate does. It's never stable over any lengthy period of time. Now, they think that by switching terminology that way, they can pull the wool over people's eyes, since, after all, climate's always changing. But I think the unintended consequence of their choice is that this means that people begin thinking, "Oh, wait a minute, I've heard that there were ice ages in the past. I remember reading something about what was that called, the medieval warm period, or what about the little ice age?" And people begin to realize, hey, climate change is just a natural thing. So I'm not sure that we really need to come up with a new label for it. What we need to do is simply to continue reminding people that this is overwhelmingly natural. I'm not denying that human emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases probably have some effect on global average temperature. I think, for example, that probably a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere after climate feedbacks, which is a variety of different ways that the climate responds to changes in surface temperature of the Earth, after that, the climate feedbacks, I think a doubling of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere would probably result in a temperature that would be about 1/2 degrees Celsius, that is about 1 degree Fahrenheit, warmer than it otherwise would be. But frankly, nobody is saying that that's dangerous. That is clearly going to be beneficial to the vast majority of the Earth, and it certainly will not be harmful to the warmest areas of the Earth, because most of the warming happens near the poles, not near the equator.
Thank you, Daniel. Go ahead.
Okay, I had one more question, if I could.
Sure.
Is it possible that if there's, in reality, some continuous measurable increase in warming, that it could be a precursor to what the book of Revelation talks about, that at the end times the sun is going to scorch men with heat?
Well, I suppose that's possible. What I would just caution ourselves about as believers is to remember that, frankly, and I used to be a professor of church history, and so you kind of get to know these things, pretty much every generation of the church has thought that it must be the last one, and Jesus is coming back within our generation. And, we are taught by the Scriptures to hope for that, to long for the return of Christ. The book of Revelation ends with the Spirit and the bride saying, "Come, come, Lord Jesus, come quickly." This is what we should want. However, we have no idea. Jesus said that the Father knew, and only the Father knows, that he didn't even allow the Son to know the time of his return. And so we're not in a position to say, this is what's happening. I think what we need to do is instead to figure what's going to happen in terms of the judgment of God on the earth is going to be cataclysmic and sudden, not something gradual like what we are experiencing in terms of any global warming at this time. And besides that, the global warming that we have experienced in the past 50 and 150 years is not historically unusual at all. It's been matched many times, even in the last couple of millennia, and many more times beyond that in Earth's history.
Daniel, thanks for your call. Next to Minneapolis, Minnesota. Jeff, you're on the air.
Hi, my name is Jeff. I was calling to talk a little bit about climate change. It seems like in this discussion, we're debating whether it's man-made or not. And I think the reality is that it is happening, and what are we prepared to do about it? I think that is my question.
Okay, thank you.
Well, of course, the question whether it's man-made is significant, very relevant to the question what we're prepared to do about it. Because if it is, in fact, not man-made, if it is largely natural, then there is, frankly, nothing that we can do about trying to control climate change. Instead, however, there's a lot we can do about preparing to adapt to whatever the climate future might hold for us. Frankly, wealthy people can live comfortably and safely from the Arctic Circle to the equator, from the wettest rainforest to the driest desert. They can live at high altitudes and at low altitudes. That's because wealth enables us to adapt no matter what the weather is, no matter what the climate is. The problem, though, with fighting global warming, trying to reduce future temperatures by reducing the emission of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, is that the only way to do that is to very significantly, greatly reduce our consumption of energy. And energy is the condition above all others for economic development. This is why there is an almost perfect correlation between carbon dioxide emissions and average human life expectancy and health in countries around the world. Countries that emit very, very little CO2 per capita have very low life expectancy, have very low human health. Countries that emit a lot have high life expectancy and high health. The reason for that is CO2 is the result of our using energy, and energy is crucial to economic production and development. So if we try to fight global warming by reducing CO2 emissions, we essentially impoverish future generations, and poverty leads to high rates of disease and premature death. We condemn them to more generations of that very thing. So I think instead what we need to be doing is to promote economic development using energy in a wise and clean way, which can be done, and seeing countries lifted out of poverty so that their disease and premature death rates decline as they've done in developed countries around the world.
But and here's the other thing. At the rate that China is building, coal-fired
power plants,
basically, it is changing the dynamics of I guess what has been put out into the atmosphere in the last 50 years. And when they're building literally one a month, they're being commissioned. I mean, we haven't done that in this country in a long time. The only gains in energy are tearing down the coal plants and putting in gas-fired power plants, which are, less CO2. But the areas that have had resistance, at least on the far right, are things like wind, where you generate energy from the wind. I mean, there's not a better way to make power, because we're not going to be using less power in the future.
Jeff,
actually, wind is not a particularly good way to make power. It's a very old-fashioned technology.
Tell you what, Dr. Beisner, I'm going to just interrupt for a moment because we have a break on us.
Okay.
And thank you for the call, Jeff, and we'll have Dr. Beisner respond to that right after the break. You're listening to Crosstalk here on VCY America. Dr. E. Calvin Beisner with us today. And again, the website, cornwallalliance.org. He'll be back with that response in just 60 seconds. You're listening to Crosstalk.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website is worldviewweekend.com. Recently, the Washington Times reported that leading evangelicals, like the president of the National Association of Evangelicals and some folks with the Southern Baptist Convention and others, including Jim Wallace's organization, Sojourners, are working together to bring about citizenship for millions of illegal aliens. Well, regardless of what you think about this, and I'm not for it, because there are many social issues that have been brought on by illegal immigration, including the lack of jobs for current American citizens. But regardless of how you feel about it, this group was reported in the Washington Times as saying that now there needs to be a campaign on this issue, and the church needs to get right on this issue by reading Matthew 25, the exhortation to clothe and feed the stranger. My friends, if we read that in context, Jesus refers to those people as brethren, Christians, fellow disciples. Let's not take Scripture out of context to push a public policy agenda.
Well, here in response to the caller here just before the break, let me ask Dr. Beisner, what about all these coal plants going up in China and all these new emissions going out there? What about wind energy? Isn't that the best resource we should be utilizing?
Well, yes, indeed. China is indeed building coal-fired power plants at an amazing rate. I don't think we should be resentful about that. Their people desperately need more energy, and it needs to be affordable. They are far poorer than we are. And so we should be pleased to see that happen. We could certainly wish that they would use cleaner technologies in how they do it. Their power plants are extremely dirty in terms of particulate emissions, soot, basically, and that makes China's cities the dirtiest air places in the world. Very, very bad for human health. And as China gets wealthier, if the government is at all responsive to public pressure, which it might be, even though it's a communist government, we can expect to see that clean up. But carbon dioxide is not a pollutant, and it's not a problem, so we shouldn't be upset about their emitting CO2. Now, the caller had mentioned wind as a great energy source and said that it really is something that would be much, much better than, for example, coal. The problem is manifold. First of all, there's environmentalists and ecologists do something called life cycle assessment. That is, you're measuring the impact of every step that goes into making and operating and eventually having to dismantle and dispose of an energy plant of whatever sort. And in the case of wind, if you count the pollution emissions involved in creating the concrete and the metals, and especially the mining and refining the rare earth metals that are used in building the turbines for wind turbines, when you count all of those things, when you count the vast distances of high-tension wire that have to be created to bring energy from the areas that are most likely to be windy to the areas that are most likely to need the energy, you count all of those things, as a matter of fact, wind turns out not to be significantly cleaner than coal or natural gas as an electricity source. However, it's much more expensive, and the basic reason for that is basic physics. Wind is a highly diffuse, very low concentration energy source, whereas coal and natural gas are very highly concentrated. Therefore, from just basic physics, you can generate electricity at a much lower cost per kilowatt hour from coal and natural gas, not to mention nuclear, which is far and away the best option, than you can from wind. The average cost per kilowatt hour to generate electricity from wind onshore is about 2 to 4 times that from coal or natural gas. For wind offshore, turbines located out in the ocean, it tends to run instead from about 3 to 6 times as much per kilowatt hour. Now, energy goes into everything that we consume: food, clothing, shelter, all the various things that we buy at the store are produced with energy. They're transported with energy. We use energy to go and buy them and to bring them home. Energy goes into everything that we do. And that means that if you raise the price of energy, you raise the price of everything else as well. Now, poor people spend a higher percentage of their incomes on energy than do middle-class and wealthy people. In America, the average family in the bottom quintile, that's the lowest 20% of income earners, spends about 19% of its take-home pay on energy every month, whereas the average family in the middle class spends only about 9% of its take-home pay. So if you raise energy prices by forcing a shift from coal or natural gas to wind for electricity generation, you're going to hurt the people at the low end of the income scale much more than the people at the middle and higher end of the income scale. And in fact, it basically amounts to a graduated tax on the poor. The exact opposite, ironically enough, of the sort of wealth redistribution that the Obama administration wants to see. It wants to redistribute wealth from the wealthy to the poor, supposedly anyway, and this instead would take more wealth away from the poor.
Dorothy in Olney, Illinois, you're on the air.
Yes, I feel like if God made this world and we've not been in it as long as it's been here, He's made it to where He takes care of the weather. You have hot spells here and cold spells there, and that's natural. That's normal. During the war, it took a lot of airplanes up to Iceland, and then we took men, of course, with them, and then they got in and they flew them on over into the war. Well, here not too many years ago, one of those planes was mentioned and how good they were, so that they let's go to Iceland and get them. We left up there when and war ended. We went up there, and they found them 400 feet under ice. They had to drill a hole and get down there to where the airplanes were, take them apart piece by piece, and bring them up to get that one plane out so they could put it back together again and fly it. And so this changing weather is what God is doing. It's been doing it ever since the world was made. You couldn't just have one place hot and one place cold. You've got to mix it, and that's what He's doing. And if we just leave all this rubbish alone, we have and leave it to the Lord and not worry about the weather. It's been going on a long time before we arrived.
Thank you so much, Dorothy.
You have directed us in a wonderful way.
We've got about 1 minute left.
The Scriptures teach us, for instance, in Jeremiah chapter 5, that the real reason people are so afraid about weather is that they've stopped fearing God. God is the one who controls climate. Also, you've directed us in a wise way in that the Bible says that the climate system, the whole Earth, is the result of the omniscient design, the omnipotent creation, and the faithful sustaining of our Creator God. You don't expect a wise designer to make the climate system so fragile that increasing carbon dioxide from 27 thousandths of 1% to 54 thousandths of 1% of the atmosphere is going to cause catastrophic global warming. That would be the work of a foolish designer. But the Bible tells us that God is a wise designer and that the whole creation declares His glory and shows His wisdom. This is part of why I'm not afraid of man-made global warming.
Genesis 8:22, while the earth remaineth, seedtime and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. Dr. Calvin Beisner has been our guest here today. Thank you, Dr. Beisner, for being with us.
Jim, thanks very, very much. Always enjoy being on with you, and I hope your listeners will come to cornwallalliance.org and learn more.
Great. Again, folks, that's cornwallalliance.org. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the Internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.